In 4 years, Australia will mark the 100th anniversary of the first landings on the shores of Gallipoli in 1915. As we get closer to the centenary, historians are involved in a heated debate about the importance of the Anzac story in Australian history. Some historians argue Australians have placed too much emphasis on Gallipoli and the Anzac legend, and that other voices from the past have been forgotten. John Stewart reports.
As dawn broke over Gallipoli, Australians and New Zealanders were among thousands gathered at Anzac Cove to remember the landings at Gallipoli 96 years ago. In Sydney, a large crowd braved the rain to attend the dawn service.
At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
Throughout the day, tens of thousands of Australians turned out to watch the march in cities and towns across the country. Overseas, the Governor-General, Quentin Bryce, led the Anzac Day service at the site of the Thai-Burma Railway, marking 68 years since Australian prisoners of war were put to work on the Hellfire Pass. Nearly 3,000 Australians died working on the railway.
Our torchlight recalls the long-lit, gruelling nights of work, the days that never gave way to nourishment and sleep. Our soldiers' strange and gruesome battlefield.
And in Afghanistan, Australian soldiers remembered their fallen comrades. The Defence Minister, Stephen Smith, spoke of the dangers facing troops.
We must expect the Taliban to fight back. The coming summer will be tough. We can expect our adversaries to strike against coalition forces and civilians alike.
For the past 3 decades, Anzac Day has grown in popularity, with younger generations marching alongside veterans. But Anzac Day has not always been so popular. During the 1960s and 70s, anti-Vietnam War protests posed a major challenge to Anzac Day services, and some feared that Australia's most important day of remembrance might soon disappear.
The Vietnam War was as divisive a war as the Great War was, and of course the defining feature of the Vietnam War is that Australian youth was being conscripted to fight that war. So the enthusiasm you see amongst young people today for Anzac Day I don't think could have been replicated in the 1970s or 1960s.
Well before the Vietnam War, Australian society was deeply divided over the nation's role in foreign wars. History professor Marilyn Lake from La Trobe University argues that Australia's anti-war movements have been largely forgotten.
There was opposition to our participation in the Boer War. There was massive opposition to World War I, and of course anti-conscription movements that were actually successful in defeating referenda for conscription. There was a lot of disillusionment in the 1920s, and not least amongst returned soldiers who came home and were deeply disillusioned by how they were treated in the 1920s, by mass unemployment, for example, in the 1930s, and by the sense that they'd been used, to fight a war which meant nothing to them.
Professor Lake also argues that the Anzac story has been given too much credit for shaping Australia's national identity.
One of the historical claims is that Australia became a nation in 1915, which of course is ridiculous in the sense that Australia became a nation in 1901 with federation. And then the claim that further goes on to say that our values and traditions were formed in military service. And again, actually, our values and traditions were very much democratic values and traditions, which were forged in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, by a whole lot of people, activists, political leaders who believed in things like equality of opportunity. They were our chief core values, not the values forged in military service.
But other historians argue that Gallipoli and the Anzac story did create a sense of nationhood.
The reality of it is, in 1915, when we go to war as Victorians, South Australians, West Australians. I think it's the experience of the Great War that does make us more conscious of our identity as a people. And I also think that it's the experience of the Great War that reminds us where we stand in the world.
The RSL rejects any claims that Anzac Day is overshadowing other parts of Australian history.
Well, one of the wonderful things that those who fell in battle have left us is this great freedom we have in this country to speak our minds and to have the freedom of expression, to be able to put a point of view which was not necessarily agreed by everybody else. Not every country in the world has that, and we owe a great debt to those who've gone forward to make sure that we have these freedoms still today.
John Stewart, Late Line.